Firstly, let me put on record that I do not condone any acts of law breaking or criminality specifically, nor am I expressing support for any individual protests or campaign groups. But equally, I find it impossible to condemn across the board, with no knowledge of context or reasoning, every protest which might be classed as illegal under UK law. I am amazed that anyone would suggest such a bald statement be put to members for endorsement, unless the aim is simply to grab headlines by pandering to climate emergency deniers and the multinational companies and their shareholders which benefit financially from the status quo. Shropshire is hardly the epicentre of the climate movement. The movers of these resolutions seem to want to conflate, for purely political purposes, large protests which have happened in other parts of the country with the rather smaller, less disruptive actions we have seen by local groups. But what I really take issue with is the call to oppose all illegal protests by environmental groups, because the word illegal does not just mean violence, destruction of property, vandalism, etc., but increasingly it is used to suppress anything this authoritarian Tory government want it to. They have just tightened the laws on protest considerably, which highlights that legality in this sense is a fairly arbitrary standard controlled by the government of the day. Indeed, ministers now have the right to change legal definitions at will without consulting Parliament, and have given the police much greater discretion to rule a protest illegal. These days, a protest simply has to be one person being noisy, and it can be declared illegal. The legislation and other recent measures was criticised by the UN's Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment because it shrinks the civic space and makes human rights violations more likely to occur and less likely to be sanctioned. Activities which were legal just 10 months ago are now arrestable offences. Illegality does not automatically equal immorality. Yes, suffragette protests were often illegal. Some civil rights protests in the US were illegal. Even the original Right to Roam protesters, the kinder trespassers of the 1930s, were breaking the law just walking up the Duke of Devonshire's hill. So many turning points which we today would not dream of reversing, rights, freedoms, the enacting of just laws and the abolition of unjust ones, they only happened due to disruptive or illegal protests, and protesters vilified in their own time are today held up as examples of heroes to our children. History is full of people who risked and lost their own freedom, even their lives, in order to progress society, despite often being in a minority. So a rather mindless blanket condemnation of the sort proposed is not only an unintelligent response to a complex and nuanced issue, it is historically illiterate and will, in my opinion, put this council on the wrong side of history. The police have enormous powers to stop illegal activity, and those powers were strengthened specifically in terms of protests in April this year. People breaking the law is a police matter. Would it not be more sensible to call on them to simply do more to enforce the law if Councillor Marshall and others find the effects of the protests intolerable? I could never imagine condoning every act which protesters commit in the name of their cause, either within or without the law. How could I without looking at each case on merit? And so neither can I condemn every action which might fall outside the scope of what this week's Home Secretary deems acceptable and calls the law. It is a ridiculous proposition and will achieve nothing, so I will not support this motion because to do so condemns too many of our heroes.